On the evening of December 2nd, 2022, the independent journalist Matt Taibbi began releasing and reporting on the so-called Twitter files, documents he obtained from his access to the internal corporate archives of Twitter. Despite its Friday night release, it quickly became one of the most viralized series of tweets in the history of the platform. The objective of his reporting was the same as the objective of any good reporting by definition: to inform the public about the previously hidden acts of some of the country's most powerful corporate and governmental actors. That is the essence of good journalism. As Taibbi wrote in one of his very first tweets that evening, quote, "The Twitter files tell an incredible story from inside one of the world's largest and most influential social media platforms. It is a Frankenstein tale of a human-built mechanism grown out of the control of its designer." Among the revelations just from that first evening of reporting, Taibbi showed that the FBI and Homeland Security were heavily involved in the process by which Twitter decides which voices and viewpoints it would allow and which it would prohibit. Twitter's chief censor, a person by the name of Yoel Roth, was the caricature of a left liberal culture warrior whose censorship decisions, including to ban the sitting president of the United States from that platform, were continuously contaminated by his desire to promote his ideological viewpoints and suppress dissent, all with the encouragement of and pressure from the Democratic Party, which justified their demands for more big tech censorship with the defining utterance of all censorship advocates, quote, "The First Amendment is not absolute." He also showed that Twitter, with the heavy influence of former FBI General Counsel Jim Baker, who upon leaving the Bureau magically reappeared as Twitter's Deputy General Counsel, how they decided to censor links to the New York Post reporting on the presidential frontrunner Joe Biden in the weeks right before the 2020 election, and to lock the New York Post out of its account for almost 2 full weeks, based on a claim that Twitter executives at the time explicitly recognized had no evidentiary support, namely that the reporting violated Twitter's prohibition against the use of hacked materials. As most major media outlets have subsequently acknowledged, and as was blatantly obvious at the time, the material found on Hunter Biden's laptop about his father's business activities in Ukraine and China were not hacked at all, and thus violated no Twitter rule. But under the pressure of the Democratic Party, the Biden campaign, and FBI's former top lawyer Jim Baker, Twitter, along with Facebook, censored that material anyway, depriving millions of Americans of understanding and learning about it right before they went to vote. Since that first night, just over a month ago, there have been 10 or more subsequent installments by multiple other independent journalists covering a wide range of topics. How federal agencies pressured Twitter to censor any dissent over COVID, how the U.S. military used Twitter to maintain fake accounts, bots, and propaganda and disinformation campaigns, the role played by corporate media outlets in attempting to launch pressure campaigns to force big tech to censor more of their political enemies, and multiple reports on how integral was the CIA, FBI, and Homeland Security in the process of dictating which views and persons could and could not be heard over the internet. Given how vast many of these disclosures were, we here on this show did what any credible and serious news organization by definition would do. We extensively covered the key revelations of this reporting, contributed more context and connected revelations from the reporting we ourselves previously have done on these same topics, and we interviewed the journalists involved to talk more about their reporting. In fact, our debut show here on Rumble, we devoted our first night to covering the revelations from the first installment of the Twitter files and spoke to Matt Taibbi about the process he used, the conditions imposed on him by Elon Musk, namely none, beyond agreeing to publish them on Twitter, and the meaning of what he regarded as the most important revelations behind one of the most extraordinary acts of pre-election censorship in decades. The following week, our second in existence, we interviewed one of the reporters from the New York Post who covered this story from the start and obviously has special insight into that censorship, given that she works for the paper whose reporting was censored, Miranda Devine. The next night, we aggregated and delved into the abundant evidence from multiple installments of these files showing how heavily involved was the FBI, specifically, and still is, in big tech censorship regime. So far removed from what their legitimate role is supposed to be. And then we interviewed the journalist Michael Schellenberger, who that day had published the first ever Twitter files, shedding light on who was responsible for the systemic censorship on big tech platforms of COVID dissent, and how that censorship regime was designed and implemented. The very next night, after reporting on the new $44 billion the U.S. Congress happened to find to send for the U.S. proxy war in Ukraine, crossing the $100 billion threshold for the year, we spoke to Li Fang, who had 1 month earlier published his own reporting proving that Homeland Security had implemented programs to seize control of big tech censorship regime. And undoubtedly, its attempt to anoint resistance fanatic Nina Yankovic, remember her as disinformation czar, was part of those designs. And then Fang used the Twitter files to show how the Pentagon had successfully deployed the exact armies of bots and fake identities and disinformation campaigns it accused Russia of using in the 2016 election. Now, our decision to cover all of these revelations was not a difficult one. We didn't spend time internally debating it. It was easy, basically automatic. These are self-evidently groundbreaking stories, revealing the previously secret schemes of the world's most powerful institutions working to manipulate our political discourse, censor the flow of information on the internet, and interfere with our last presidential election. If you don't regard that as significant, what is? Anyone worthy of the title journalist would, of course, jump at the chance to dig into the internal files of one of America's most influential corporations, Twitter, or for those who didn't get to do that, would of course dissect and analyze those revelations, try to add to them, and bring key context and meaning to one's audience. So despite our shows barely being 2 weeks old, that's exactly what we did over and over and over. And yet, we were noticeably almost alone in covering those stories. A couple of cable shows on Fox, along with a few right-wing websites and internet programs, did cover them. But outside of those isolated cases, there was and continues to be something close to a full-on blackout in the nation's largest media corporations when it comes to covering those revelations from these Twitter files. A blackout against covering not some of these stories, but all of them. This media blackout says a great deal about the state of corporate journalism in the United States, and the way this blackout was imposed says even more. Starting with that first night a month ago, like-minded liberal employees of major media corporations do what they always do now. They formed a hive-minded herd on Twitter to speak with one unified and very ideological voice. And what they had to say could not have been clearer, nor their motives more transparent. Ignore these Twitter files. The revelations are trivial and meaningless, a nothing burger. The journalist reporting that, Matt Taibbi, is not a legitimate journalist, even though he has more journalistic accomplishments than all of us combined, and a larger and more loyal audience than we could ever dream of compiling in 10 lifetimes. Why, despite those far greater accomplishments, is Taibbi not a real journalist, like such towering giants of the profession, such as Oliver Darcy, Ben Collins, and Taylor Lorenz? Because Taibbi is not even an employee of a large media corporation, so how could he be possibly a real or legitimate journalist? Everyone knows that submitting to the HR department of corporate giants is a prerequisite to being a legitimate journalist. Even though, when the First Amendment was enacted, it was designed not to protect some special credentialed corporate priesthood called journalists, but was instead designed to protect the act of journalism, which all citizens, regardless of your title, with a printing press or a pen, not only had the right to do, but were more than capable of doing. And so starting from that very first night that the Twitter files began, they immediately began spinning a narrative that was not only designed to justify their ignoring these subsequent releases and that first installment, but also to train their followers to do the same. In other words, don't just ignore the reporting from Taibbi they decreed, ignored anything that comes from these documents into the future. And this message was not just self-justifying, but even more so was designed to train the hordes of liberals who still trust these media institutions and do what they're told, that they should henceforth ignore everything that was reported because none of it mattered and none of it was trustworthy, and that's exactly what they proceeded to do. The language they used that first night was so identical, creepily so, that it seemed like they were little more than digitally created creatures spawned by some centralized artificial intelligence program that created the perfect model of a compliant little power-serving media employee, immediately cloned them all, and then placed them in every major media corporation in the country. Corporate journalists and liberal activists alike, and really, what's the point of pretending anymore that those are two different categories, malign Taibbi using exactly the same phrase. This person on Twitter compiled just a few examples. Listen to how identical their language was, not just the mentality, but actually the words they used. From MSNBC's Mehdi Hassan, quote, imagine volunteering to do online PR work for the world's richest man on a Friday night in service of nakedly and cynically right-wing narratives and then pretending you're speaking truth to power. From Ben Collins, NBC's disinformation reporter, quote, imagine throwing it all away to do PR work for the richest person in the world. Humiliating shit. From John Neffel of Media Matters, the quote, the Taibbi threat is a giant example of overwriting when you don't have the goods, but you don't want to admit you're just doing PR work for the world's richest person. Michael McDermott, a Democratic strategist who sounds exactly like these journalists, of course, quote, Matt Taibbi always was and still remains a fraud. Doing PR work for the richest person in the world should come as no surprise. Seemingly every left liberal journal, in part enraged that they were left out of the reporting, and in larger part concerned, deeply concerned, that they and their friends inside Twitter and the FBI would be exposed by it, quickly invented the same mass-endorsed formula for telling their flock to distrust and then ignore everything that was reported. The very reliable liberal party... Thanks for watching this clip from System Update. Catch our full shows for free, live weekdays at 7 p.m. Eastern on Rumble, and join our locals community at greenwald.locals.com for all of my written journalism, exclusive after-show Q&As, and more.